The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining today's webinar. Today we will be speaking about bridging the SOC skills gap with automation and analytics. My name is Michael Holden from Byte Security Partnerships. I am pleased to be joined today by Richard Cassidy, Senior Director of Security Strategy at Exabeam, and Matt Walmsley, the Head of EMEA Marketing from Vectra, both experts on automating security, who will be taking you through the bulk of today's presentation. Today's webinar will go as follows. Firstly, a short overview of Bytes. Then we will go through some of the discussion points for the session. I will then introduce our speakers, who will take you through how SOC automation can bridge the cyber skills gap, which will be followed by a Q&A session. But first, some housekeeping. Attendee lines will be on mute throughout the session. There will be a Q&A at the end, so please post questions in the questions window, and I will field them to our speakers during this Q&A. This is a purely strategic discussion. Any commercials can be discussed with your Byte account manager afterwards. Everyone will receive the recording after the session. And lastly, we have a feedback survey at the end of the session, and would appreciate it if you could take 2 minutes to complete it, as we use these to make sure that our webinars are still hitting the mark. Who are Bytes? Byte Security Partnerships is the specialist security partner of the Bytes Group in the UK. Bytes aim to marry up the agility, insight, and personal approach from the smallest partner with the scale and the scope that comes from being part of a much larger group. We are proud here at Bytes of the technical expertise we have around the solutions we deploy, and that allows us to enjoy the top-tier vendor partnerships, which allows us to deliver for customers on both the technical and commercial sides. We work across the full spectrum of information security, from perimeter and next-gen firewall through to cloud and mobile security, data security, and access and authentication, offering both hardware and software solutions. What we offer and add value to business and vendor partners and solutions is the technical suite of services that we are able to deploy, whether that's looking at security strategy deployment, technology mapping, project scoping, planning and delivery, or 24/7 direct-to-engineer support. There are a wide variety of ways in which we can act as an extension of your IT teams to make sure that the solutions you deploy add value quickly. That's enough about us. Let's talk about automation and analytics. Today's discussion will share the advancements in SIEM and threat hunting technology, which provide valuable SOC automation and augment analysts' capabilities, bringing discovery, containment, and response closer to real time. As mentioned, we are joined by Richard Cassidy and Matt Walmsley from Exabeam and Vectra. Exabeam are a SIEM company which allow organizations to detect, investigate, and respond to cyber attacks more efficiently, allowing security operations and insider threat teams to work smarter. Vectra is the world leader in applying AI to detect and respond to cyber attacks in cloud, data center, and enterprise infrastructures in real time, empowering security analysts to perform incident investigations and AI-assisted threat hunting. Due to this, we have partnered these two vendors up to help reduce the burden of understaffed and overworked security teams. With that, we'll go over to Matt Walmsley.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. So we'll start today's session by looking at how there are opportunities to automate threat hunting, and how that automation is often increasingly powered by the application of AI, and more specifically the application of machine learning as a subset of AI. If we start with the reason why automation is increasingly important in security operations, it's probably a well understood truth, but let's just remind ourselves that the attack surface inside our enterprises that we have to protect is growing rapidly with the fast adoption of cloud, mobility, visiting devices, IoT. The attack surface is expanding, and as a threat actor, there's so many different places I can enter and move around within my an organization. And the methodologies that I'll use in pursuit of those goals, which define the threat landscape, are growing just as fast. And at the same time, we have to recognize as a professional practice that a primarily defensive mindset has proven time and time again to be imperfect. There are no perfect defensive controls and defenses out there. Something can and will find a way in. If I'm a motivated, well-resourced, persistent attacker, I can find a way inside an organization. I just need to apply myself diligently and over a period of time. So we're seeing this move in good cybersecurity practice away from being purely defensive to also being able to detect and respond and learn and adapt based upon what the attacker is doing. And all that's happening in a world where we're massively under-resourced as a practice. There's going to be over 225,000 unfilled cybersecurity roles in Europe in the next couple of years. So, we're having to defend an increasingly larger attack surface against more dynamic threats with a real, lack of people and talent. And so that does open up an opportunity to very rationally apply automation in the pursuit of, in my case, threat hunting. And later we'll hear from Exabeam about how to do that inside the SIEM in the SOC as well. And ultimately, our goal, particularly when we're thinking about threat hunting, is this rationale that we know someone is going to get in. I almost got this compromised mindset. I know the attacker is in my organization somewhere. It then becomes a question of how quickly and accurately, with the resources that I have, can I find him? And if I can do that in a timely manner, it can make the difference between a contained security incident and a full-blown breach that I have to report to GDPR or makes the headlines. And so, we understand the ways attackers get in. Quite often, it's with a bit of help from our human firewalls, our human users, typically through phishing and things like that. And then, having that user open up some kind of tooling which utilizes a vulnerability, some an exploit, and obtains some kind of shell. And at that point, the attacker has intruded us, and then goes on a very lengthy journey from that initial compromise towards their end goal. So after launching that exploit, they gain some persistence inside the organization, inside the device. They start to do reconnaissance behavior. They expand their presence and persistence. They start to understand the context of where they're operating. So they do reconnaissance of the domain and the subnet. They'll look to identify and escalate credentials and privileges, and then move around laterally around the organization, jumping segments, and ultimately to identify and target their end game, be that data inside the cloud, data inside the data center, either to manipulate, to deny, or to even steal those. Now, each of those steps, the attacker has to exhibit particular behaviors, and each of those behaviors gives us an opportunity to find them early in their life cycle. And those behaviors are well understood, and they're evidenced from real world. And that's why increasingly we're seeing frameworks like the Microtech Framework become very, very, very useful ways of understanding how adversaries are deploying new techniques and tactics in pursuit of their goals. And if we go to the Microtech Framework, we go to miter.org, we can look at how attacker methodologies are being mapped to that journey, that life cycle, that kill chain, if you like, of initial access all the way through to exfiltration. But if we break out those methodologies and ask ourselves, well, where do they happen in the life cycle? What we see is, a lot of the innovation is happening around the initial compromise. How do I get in? And that's what tends to make all the news in our industry. Zero-day exploits, new tools are coming in there. But there's all these other behaviors that have to happen after they've gained access to the network. And those post-intrusion methodologies, those post-intrusion techniques actually evolve quite slowly. This graph looks at the Microtech Framework. It looks at the innovation in endpoint and physical and on the network as well. And we can see that most of the innovation, most of the changes in behavior that attackers are using are manifesting on the endpoint and not on the network. And that means the network is a very interesting place to perform threat hunting. It gives us the opportunity to see all the communications, that look at the communications agnostically from the endpoint device without having to put any clients on there, regardless of whether it's an IoT, a laptop, or a VM, or a cloud instance from there. So with that said, we then need to think about how we perform security operations. And it may be that we don't all have security operations centers. We may not all be sat there in a formal SOC, but I would suggest we all do security operations, looking for identifying the evidence of threat actors inside our organization and responding to them in an appropriate manner. And you might, one model for thinking about, the level of maturity or proactivity that you're able to exhibit in security operations is on this slide here, and it's from a CISO at a US university, and he considered, how agile we are and how aware of the threat landscape we have. And it starts off with, in a very reactive way where something bad happens and we run to the fire, figure it out, and put the flames out. It may be something as simple as quarantining and re-imaging a device. Going to the other end of the spectrum where we're actually becoming predictive, understanding where attackers might come in, looking for the evidence, trying to get ahead of them. And that's really the promise and the interest that threat hunting actually has. It's it's the goal of actually getting proactive. You hypothesizing based upon really good intel about how and where you might be attacked, and trying to get ahead of the attack and find them in a proactive manner. And then if we look at where the SOC analysts are spending their time, or the people concerned with identifying and responding to threats, we have a very large dwell time where the attacker is in the network and active. The time between them getting in there and you detecting them and understanding them can be very, very long. If you look at something like the M-Trends report from Mandiant, it will tell us that in Europe, the median dwell time for attackers is over 120 days. So that's a long time where attackers are active inside an organization before they're discovered. And in quite a large percentage, in the 40% plus, we find out about an attacker from an external party, so somebody knocking on your door saying, "Hey, is this your data out in the wild I just found?" Right, so quite often we're blind to those attackers when we get in. And once we do identify them, we've then got to triage them. So we need to validate, we need to report on it, we need to take responsive actions to contain them, we need to validate that those responsive actions have worked, and then remediate, and then maybe change our security posture as well. And Richard from Exabeam is going to drill down and give you some examples in his presentation about how those activities work and what a day in the life of a SOC analyst. So we'll leave that there. But each of these steps where SOC analysts are working, present an opportunity to provide a level of automation to do some of the heavy lifting. So you're not being bombarded with lots and lots of alerts. You're not getting fatigued, and actually being presented with evidence and context, so you can make a very quick, high efficacy decision and intervention in a short time frame. So automation is very, very useful in modern security operations, but it's not the answer to everything. Automation doesn't mean giving the keys to the machines and we as human beings walking away. We as humans have unique understanding of the context of our organization. You understand, what services are important, where those services are going to be worked. So this isn't the case of automating, just the detection and the actions that follow. It could be automating and correlating the detection and investigative actions and presenting the output of that to a security operations person, who then can make a decision about the action they want to take, and maybe automating the execution of those decisions from there. For example, we might find network-based ransomware, and we might very quickly want to isolate that host and get it away so that very time-sensitive threat can be stopped propagated. Likewise, if we saw some command and control to an external party, it may be that we don't want to automate the blocking of the service that command and control is over, because it may impact legitimate business applications too. That's an example of where automation still needs human in the loop, if you will, and that's really best practice when we think about detection and response in SOC. And so that thinking informed some work that Vectra did to build what we call a network detection and response platform, and it's called Cognito. And it starts with the data. And the ultimate source of truth for us, if we want to go threat hunting and see everything across the network is the raw network traffic itself. The packets never lie. They're not an interpretation. They're not sampled. They're the immutable record of exactly what was said, by whom, to whom, when. But the challenge with network traffic is it's really, really large volumes of it. So what we've done is built this Cognito platform that listens to the network traffic through physical span ports, through virtual sensors that sit under a hypervisor or sit out in the cloud, and allow us to collect and generate security-specific metadata from that network traffic, and then feed that to a number of security operations toolings. The first is a workbench. The second is a threat hunting capability called Recall, and the final one is an automated detection engine. So the network never lies. The packets are the ultimate source of truth, and we can provide that security-enriched metadata straight out to your existing tools, including SIEM. So if we wanted to, we could be constantly listening to the network, generating security insights of everything that's happening on your network, and feeding that into your SIEM, into your own Elasticsearch stacks or your own tooling and stuff, and we call that stream. The second thing we do is provide that same security metadata and stick it into a cloud application called Recall, and this really gives us the ability to have a workbench as a security operations analyst where I can go and do manual investigations, go back in time, I can hypothesize. Basically anything that the platform has seen is available there for me to investigate and hunt. So if I find out through some threat intel about a new threat, I can go back retrospectively and I see if that threat's already impacted me. It can accelerate incident investigations and really focus on security and not the infrastructure. But what we do need is something to alert us and inform the start of that investigative journey. And that brings us to an AI-powered tool that we call Detect. And what Detect does is take that same security metadata and search through it in real time to identify the immutable attacker behaviors that we looked at a few minutes ago. It will score them and prioritize them and then present them to the analyst, to your security tooling, and provide the start of the string to pull on to understand the attack. And the way we do that is by focusing on the behaviors that attackers must manifest. So this is more than just simple anomaly detection. Anomaly detection will find lots of anomalies that anomalies are statistically rare, but actually operationally very common inside network traffic. Right? So just because something is unusual doesn't mean it's necessarily bad. There's lots of unusual but benign things that happen inside our network communications. And that's why by then focusing on which actions would then have value to an attacker, by focusing on the things that attackers must do, informed by things like the Microtech Framework, that we can have a very, very high fidelity, low noise detection capability that happens in real time. And if we focus on what attackers do as opposed to what attackers are, so don't concern ourselves with the tools that they're using, but rather the behaviors that they manifest, even if they're hiding inside encrypted traffic, we can still spot the evidence of malicious behavior. So this could be things like data exfiltration through HTTPS. It could be command and control going through encryption. And in a world where not only our internet traffic, but increasingly our internal network traffic is becoming increasingly encrypted, this behavioral approach means that we're no longer blinded by that. So we might not be able to see what's being stolen, but we can see that there is evidence of data exfiltration going on within encryption. Now, of course, with encryption, traditional techniques might be to do some kind of man-in-the-middle decrypted inspection, but that would require you to have the certificates available. Strong application security is increasingly using certificate pinning, which means that's not possible. And if you think about a bad actor, they're forced to use the lay of the land. So if you've got a lot of encrypted traffic inside your organization, the attacker will generally use encryption as a place to hide in plain sight. and you're unlikely to have the certificates for that as well. So, DPI, deep packet inspection, and SSL decrypt on the fly is increasingly blinded. So how can we build AI capabilities to automate the detection of attackers? Well, at the very heart of it, it isn't a mathematical problem. It's a problem of security research. It's founded in good evidence-based security research practice, identifying those behaviors, proving that the fundamental attack behavior is valid, and then partnering with the data science. And this is how our development team work. It starts with a threat researcher, an ethical hacker that goes out and identifies and says, you know what, I want to find, how can I build a detection capability that would find me suspect or rogue administration behavior? Okay, how can I find something that looks to find a remote access Trojan? Well, the security researcher might go out and research remote access Trojans. He'll look for evidence about all the different ones out there. He'll collect data samples of known remote access Trojans and data samples for legitimate remote access as well, which can look very, very similar. And then they partner with a data scientist, and the data scientist is the person that takes the hypothesis and the data and then builds an AI model to detect that. And those AI models can be pre-trained, so we call that a supervised learning model, whereby we can build a model in advance before we release it into a production environment that understands what it's looking for. So it doesn't have to learn based on local context. And that's very useful for threat behaviors that manifest in pretty much the same way across everybody's network. Remote access Trojan would be one of them. Now, there would be things that would be malicious that we want to detect that would be unique to your organization. Right? Those we have to learn through observation. And there it's more an idea of clustering and things like that. So this might be an example of suspicious admin behavior, and reconnaissance behaviors like that. And so the data scientist builds, validates, and tests with the security researcher these attacker behavior models and then pushes them out. And these are signatureless. They don't know what tools they're looking for. They know what behaviors they're looking for. So in this example of a remote access Trojan, when Shadow Brokers, which was the alleged NSA release of tooling that went out on WikiLeaks, there was a 0-day, never been seen before in the wild, remote access Trojan. Our remote access Trojan algorithm spotted it and fired. Not because it's seen it before, but because this remote access Trojan acted like a rat. It exhibited ratish behavior, and that enabled us, to find 0 days. So taking a behavioral approach to building detection models really gives a very durable, high fidelity, low noise approach. And then we apply this thinking, this approach to building these models across the whole of the life cycle of the attack. And here's just some examples of the ones we've put in the Cognito Detect platform. Now, each of these different behaviors, hidden DNS tunnel, malware update, suspicious HTTP, is an individual machine learning algorithm. It may be very diverse. It may use a whole different set of algorithmic approaches. Some of them may be pre-trained using supervised learning. Some of them will be untrained and use local learning. And if you want to find out more about that, you'll see in the handout section of the webinar tool, I put a white paper in there that looks at the data science approach that we're using there. So you can educate yourself a little bit on supervised, unsupervised, and increasingly neural nets as well from there. So what we have here, if you think about the life cycle of attack, is multiple opportunities to have a silent tripwire to use the raw network communications to identify attacker behaviors throughout the life cycle of the attack. So multiple opportunities to find that attacker. And it's not our goal to try and find every single behavior that the attacker does. Our goal is to provide as many detection opportunities that are high fidelity and low noise, high efficacy. So we do not burden you with a tsunami of false or benign alerts. And how that manifests and turns out is it dramatically reduces the workload on analysts. They're no longer looking at hundreds of security events. They're looking at a very small number of detections with context, with the information on a small number of hosts. So we took did some analysis on detections from the Vectra Cognito platform, and we normalized it per 1,000 hosts observed. And this, this is from data we did last year. on average, from the customers that shared anonymized metadata with us, for every 1,000 hosts that we observed, we saw 841 security events. What the Cognito AI had done was actually distill those 841 events down to 65 different detections, right? Which it then allocated out to 29 hosts. So from a security operations perspective, I don't have to look at 141 events and figure out, well, which ones of these are really salient? What does all this mean? I'm now being presented with, here are the 29 hosts that are exhibiting in real time attacker behavior. These are the behaviors that I'm seeing. Here's the evidence and context of that behavior. What do you want to do about them? And in fact, of those 29 hosts with detections, only 5 of them were prioritized as high or critical hosts. So that's a massive reduction in the very laborious workload that the frontline tier 1 security analysts have to do. Right. So this capability can dramatically shrink attacker dwell time, but it has to work within the people and processes and other SOC tooling that you've had. So this goes beyond just simple API integration. So this kind of capability of network detection and response can also integrate with your infrastructure platforms, your cloud service provider platforms, your packet capture platforms, your hypervisors if you're running your own DCs in there, to your enforcement points if you want to isolate hosts, if you want to isolate processes, so your endpoint software, your firewalls if you like, and to the nexus of your SOC, which is really your investigation engines, which is generally going to be a SIEM platform as well. And in fact, this combination of tooling and capabilities forms what Gartner talk about as a SOC visibility triad. And at the pinnacle of the triad is SIEM in UEBA, which you'll hear from Exabeam about in a moment. And the SIEM is really the nexus of collecting all the logs and other data from the whole of the tooling and capabilities, trying to give you and stitch together the God's eye view. And then underneath them, underpinning that, you have the detection and response capabilities, either from endpoint software, which is really thinking about that as the SAS, the feet on the ground, looking at the particular client device, and the network detection and response where Cognito is. And you can think of that almost as the drone in the sky, looking at the whole battlefield, giving you a broad strategic overview of exactly what's going on. And you can use each of these elements of the SOC visibility triad to back each other up and look at it. If an endpoint's compromised, maybe the EDR tool's compromised. If it says it spoke to device A, but the network says, well, actually, you spoke to device A and device B, maybe that endpoint tool has got a sub-OS rootkit and is being subverted. So, defense in depth is really best realized when you have multiple and very different perspectives, and that's exactly what endpoint and network detection response provide, very, very different capabilities across there. And what we're seeing is, particularly on the network, this detection capability in the network, Gartner have already put out some strategic planning assumptions last year that by the end of next year, 60% of detection capabilities will be augmented with analytical methods like machine learning from that, and a lot of them will be have to be cloud-based and also looking for internal detection capabilities. Many enterprises have very strong detection capabilities at the perimeter as part of their defensive controls, but candidly remain blind inside the enterprise from lateral movement once somebody gets in there. So let me leave you with a couple of thoughts about where there are opportunities for AI to help us automate, particularly in the detection and threat hunting space. And the first is a very human area. Think about how many SOC analysts do you have today, even if that's not their formal title. How difficult is it to hire and retain them? How many security alerts do we have to handle each day? How long does it take us to identify, confirm, and respond and validate to those alerts? That's the triaging from there. And have we even begun to get proactive, or are we still just constantly in firefighting mode? So that security team performance is an area where automation can help drive productivity, but it can also help you with some very specific technical detection gaps and blind spots that we have. Go back to that Microtech Framework. Look at the evidence of how attackers are behaving once they're inside your organization. How would you spot them today if they're inside your network or moved into your cloud instances? How would you spot their reconnaissance, their lateral movement, their privilege escalation? How would you handle it if they were using IoT devices or mobile and visiting devices where you've got no direct control and visibility of them? Would you spot your insider threats? And increasingly, would you spot them using legitimate services for illegitimate gains? This is the area where we can automate and help bring and improve visibility inside the organization. So that's just a little about the opportunities for applying AI in threat hunting. What I'd like to do now is hand over to Richard, and he's going to talk to us about how Exabeam can help automation in the SOC through a SIEM platform. And then if you have questions, please put them in the tool, and we'll come back to that at the end of the webinar.
Thank you for that fantastic presentation. So I'll just share my screen, and then we'll get started on the second section. Great. Okay. Let me hit play. Away we go. Perfect. Okay. Good. So hopefully you can see the right screen.
Richard,
everybody
we can't see your screen yet. We see a white screen at the moment.
All right. Okay, let me try that again. Apologies.
There we go.
All right, let me switch that view so that it all makes a little bit more sense. There we go. Perfect. We got there. Excellent. Well, look, I've got about 25 minutes, and I really want to sort of add to the story that Matt kind of presented in terms of where sort of SIEM kind of functionality has let us down from a SOC enablement perspective, and kind of where that's led us to today, and how we can take some of the great insights and outputs of solutions like Vectra and add, a much more holistic view of exactly what's happening. And then when we extend outside of that kind of remit, and we're looking outside of just, detection of particular threat vectors, maybe we're looking at analytics across a much wider play, whether it be financial use cases or non-security use cases, kind of how the industry is shaped up to deliver those functions, with the current tool sets and technologies today. So it really all starts here with essentially a big pile of log data, right? Whether that's alerts or whether that's network packet information or whether that's infrastructure data from your cloud sources or other security tool sets. This is only growing, and actually, if we look at most sort of SOC functions, almost all of them lead back to this pile of data, right? So whether we have identification of an attack vector, whether it be remote access activity, whether it be kind of zero-day-esque malware activity on the endpoint or in the browser, we still, in almost all cases, need to come back to the data trail to figure out what happened before and what happened after. And that's kind of problematic, right? And that's really where the SOC pain kind of sits today. It's getting that deeper context outside of specific tool sets as to what's actually occurred, and what level of risk does that pose to my business based upon how new it is, how different it is, and based upon its activity over a wider period of time. And I'll give you more background and context on what that means. So let's kind of look at the SOC workflow in practice today, right? It all starts with the alerts, right? And whether that comes from, an existing tool set or your own sort of intelligence capabilities with correlation rules, or you might be kind of dabbling in your own data science functions. At the end of the day, you're really trying to drive alerts that are meaningful, that you can action and respond to. And essentially, those alerts need to be alerts that protect assets, whether they be users or data. But actually, the alerts themselves start off a process which is very well known by any SOC analyst and well known by any sort of C-level leader that's looking to get an answer quickly that a potential data breach is in progress or has occurred, and what was the reach or the remit of that. The alert is just the beginning, it's the tip of the iceberg. So I'm going to take on a kind of a story which will kind of map into this presentation. But this is a typical trail, right? What's happened in this story that I'm about to take you through is there's been a VPN connection from a specific country, and in that VPN connection, there's been access to a database. 600 gig of HR information's been exfiltrated, and that's essentially what's happening here. So if we talk about the kind of first alert you might see in that sort of fairly typical kind of alert sort of process, is you'll get some VPN alerts, right? You'll get a connection has come from a particular country. But, you know, that may not even start a process, right? Just looking at VPN connections and trying to figure out what's legitimate, what's illegitimate, what's normal or abnormal is actually nigh on impossible with standard sort of traditional correlation rules and SIM-based approaches. And even if you deploy machine learning or anomaly detection to that in its strictest sense, right, supervised learning models to detect known bad activity, VPN connections aren't bad. So finding out what's an unusual connection to your network or unusual type of activity has to kind of fall into different models, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So you connect in, and then maybe you'll get an alert from an asset that says, we're seeing a new host name on the network. That's probably not a bad starting point if it's an alert. And you'll kind of dig, search and pivot into that and try to find out more about what's happened, or, you know, why is this asset showing up? Is it rogue? Is it something that's just been built in the last 48 hours and my systems haven't yet understood or learned or seen it before? But you might want to dig deeper as an analyst. If you get this alert that a new asset's kind of communicating, you might want to look at, you know, what is it doing? And then if it's doing something, is that something normal or abnormal based upon what's occurring? So that typically starts that trail of search and pivot again on the raw log data or going into the packet data tool sets. And then you might want to look at any activity that occurred across the network. So you might get alerts that there are new activities like accounts being created or maybe account switching activity. And remember, these are all isolated alerts that kind of happen in a typical attack chain or a chain of malicious sort of nefarious activity. But again, if you start your investigation there, well, how do I know that this account that's been created is potentially a jump host account? How do I know how abnormal it is versus not? And then moving on, what about access to a particular server or database? Let's say you get access from a user that it doesn't normally access the server, but how would you know what's normal or abnormal if you don't understand using kind of machine learning functions what that baseline looks like? What if an application started on that server, a new process? You know, you can use whitelisting technologies, you can create blacklists, you can use traditional sort of threat detection functions to look for known bad applications or activity. But what if it isn't something that there's a signature for machine learning analysis that's capable of detecting? In fact, what if it isn't even malicious? What if a legitimate application is being spun up by an illegitimate user who's got credentials through, you know, maybe a man-in-the-middle attack in a cafe or a coffee shop in a particular airport? I mean, the list of what ifs are endless. But if we're looking at what's different on that server, is that application different? It can be very difficult to do it in a traditional technology approach. And then in this particular instance, you know, maybe there's something that happens within the app that's abnormal. Like in this case, the database has had a request for a fast amount of data. Well, you know, if we're analyzing this data being requested, what's going to be important to us is where does it go? And if it goes somewhere, is that somewhere known bad or not? And if it's not known bad, if it goes to a legitimate site that the corporation normally uses, or something that hasn't been categorized as bad, it can be very difficult again for the analyst just off that particular upload of data to figure out what's happened. And maybe if we're just talking about access to those systems or locations themselves, again, the problem is if you get alerts that saying a file has been opened, and you know DLP is the bane of our lives because it often creates more alerts than it could possibly handle. But not all those alerts should be ignored, and in there's going to be something that we really don't want to miss. It's very difficult to understand which of those alerts are the ones I really need to focus on. And again, if you're looking at these alerts in isolation, or you're trying to build a traditional SIM platform to connect the dots, you've got to ask a lot of questions and know a lot of things before the event to get some level of meaningful outcome. And honestly, I've worked in SOCs, I've built SOCs from the ground up. I've been involved in threat hunting and covert operations for finance organizations in threat hunting environments. This is a very, very typical day in the life of a SOC analyst. It take an alert, I have to search and pivot to figure out what on earth's going on. And it's what's really overwhelming our SOC teams to provide the value, which is, do I have risk to my business or assets, or don't I? And if I do, what's actually really happened and what do I need to go and remediate? So, we talk about the modern SOC. What does that look like? Well, today SOCs might represent this picture, right? We know alert fatigue is a huge problem. It's already been spoken about by Gartner and Forrester at massive length. And we're all facing that problem ourselves in some form or another as an organization. But typically, alert fatigue drives one of the biggest risk vectors, which is missed incidents. And I'll talk about some examples of that in a moment. But then we deploy new products, new solutions, new capabilities that do phenomenal sort of point detection functions in their own right. But you kind of get a lot of noise, right? A lot of signal to noise ratio. And, if you're working with a sort of limited SOC function, it can be very difficult to manage all of that data, as important as it is, using traditional kind of processes and methodologies. And then the real big issue of the kind of three key things in SOC management is, how do I know what's truly different from what I'm seeing versus what I already have seen? So is this user actually doing something malicious, or is it just that they're new? Or is this a zero-day threat, or it's just that it's some activity that's been performed for the first time but isn't actually a bad activity in my environment? It's very difficult to understand, is one user's activity different from another if you're just applying standard security kind of focuses on that. You really have to start looking at the data in a very different way. So let's move on real quickly from kind of what the analyst world really is, right? And we'll take a different approach. So, when we go to the board and we ask for funding and we want to try to, get more investment in security or compliance or data sort of governance projects, we have to kind of position a message, right, of why we think it's important. But, I speak to a lot of CISOs. I've sort of been to a lot of Gartner events and Forrester events, and I often hear this story when we talk about what the board thinks that security or the GRC teams do within an organization, SOC included. It's that we possibly burn more cash than they can possibly throw at us, and we're doing not a lot of other things than just sitting at a dashboard, browsing the internet, probably having the time of our lives. But the reality is, if you ask the SOC manager what we think analysts are doing, you'll get two different answers, right? One is, these guys are geniuses. They connect dots and come with, answers to questions that I couldn't possibly fathom. And depending on which SOC you work in, you might have a different view on things. And they actually think that SOC analysts do nothing at all and could all be outsourced and dealt with much better by a third party. Not saying that's the way to do it, but these are some of the opinions that you'll find if you talk to different SOC managers or security teams across different companies and industries. But actually, all sort of jovial sort of rhetoric aside, what is it that actually we're doing in the analyst world? What is the SOC team trying to deliver? And it's quite simplistically this. It's taking a huge amount of data, which is essentially a jigsaw puzzle, a story that gets you to a point of, do I have a problem or don't I? And that story has to build out in a way that you see the picture. And in that picture, you know exactly what you're dealing with from start to finish, so that you can create a remediation, a mitigation strategy. You can report up to the auditors. You can report to the industry, God forbid you suffer a breach, as to exactly what happened, how, where, when, and why, which gives your consumers a great deal more confidence in your ability in your security stack. Because the reality is, I don't care what tool set you have in your environment, you can't detect every threat. You can't detect every attack. We don't know everything. And Matt alluded very well to the shadow brokers instance, that happened a while ago. We didn't know that zero-day threat activity existed, okay? We only found out by virtue of either tool sets like Vectra detecting this remote access activity, which is a fantastic sort of example of how powerful that tool is, or you're the unlucky company that didn't have these tool sets in play and were breached. But once you've detected something, you need to know how it even got in the first place, what else did it touch, and where did it potentially move, and how can we shut the doors? How can we really get our SOC team to very quickly pivot into protecting the assets in business and not just doing this kind of attack response methodology? We want to get much more proactive and been able to shut the avenues of compromise to our organization. And look, I'm not going to spend really any time on these slides about kind of what happens if you let these problems kind of grow in your organization. But, you know, what is interesting in this particular slide is the number of alerts the average enterprise has to deal with. And this is a report back in fact, 2014. So it's fairly old by all counts, you know, right now. But nothing's changed a great deal. If you look at some of the latest figures, we're still dealing with several million events across all of our tool sets every day as an average sort of enterprise. But only a small subset of that data is what we would deem to be security events. And then a smaller subset of that data is sort of noteworthy, is kind of actionable. And then of those actionable events, you'll find even still that there's a smaller level that we have even the resource to respond to. And that kind of ties into the message that both Matt and I are talking about today, which is, you know, machine learning AI functions can really help supercharge and transform your SOC operations. And I want to talk about how Exabeam approached that now. But, you know, before we go into some of the machine learning functions, you know, machine learning has been around for some time. It's not new, right? It goes back a significant sort of period of time. You know, algorithms date back to, you know, the Constantinople kind of era, right? They go way back into Greek sort of mathematics, but machine learning in of itself is something that we've been using on our phones since the first kind of touchscreen keyboard was released on the iPhone all those decades ago. And Apple had a very, very interesting problem. It almost caused a delay of the launch of the iPhone in that they just couldn't get the keyboard to work. You try to type in a word and it was just, it wouldn't respond in time, or it just didn't, you pressed the letter T and it didn't hit the letter T, some other letter. It was just horrendous. It was impossible to use. So Steve Jobs at the time called a halt to all innovation on the iPhone. Forget about the apps, forget about the UI. We've got to fix the keyboard problem. So all of the engineers at Apple HQ were told to come up with a way to solve the keyboard issue, make it usable so we can sell the iPhone. And actually, it was machine learning, and I've got a link here to the YouTube video that talks through the story, that solved the problem. And of all the engineers that presented wild and wacky ways to have a functional keyboard, they still had the same problems. They just didn't work. They weren't ergonomically effective. So the engineer that cracked the problem used machine learning, and it was as simple as this, and it's still in your phones today, that the Apple iPhone or the Samsung Galaxy, whatever it is that you're using, will use machine learning to predict, based on the dictionary you're using, the most common words that you will type out. So if you're so the tends to be very, very popular. So T, you'll find that, you know, if you try to hit the G after the T, you'll probably get the H more often than you'll get the G, because the database, machine learning, is predicting that the next letter should be H. But if you're typing out the word, you know, tonight, and you're not trying to type the, and you rarely use the word the, then you'll be hitting O, and machine learning will update its algorithms. It will go, actually, hold on a second, this user on this phone actually uses the word tonight more than they use the word the. So you'll find that it'll be expecting you to hit the next letter O. And what machine learning is doing on the iPhone or any keyboard that's touch-based today is the hit point on the screen becomes wider and bigger on the basis that it's expecting you to hit that key. So if, and this is a classic example, you've all experienced it, right? You try to type maybe the word top, right? And you go to, you know, T, and then you hit O, and then all of a sudden, for some reason, it says, oh no, you've hit I. Or you try to type the word the, and it maybe thinks you've hit another letter. That's because on the new phone, you haven't quite taught it yet what you're going to be touching and the letter you're going to be hitting. So it hasn't learned yet what your next letters tend to be. So it tries to predict for you what you're going to hit. And it can get quite frustrating when you're trying to, you know, speed text, you know, on your way to catch a train or whatever it might be. But that's just a short background on that story. And it's a great video on YouTube you should watch. It's a very interesting story. So how do we put that in practice now when it comes to what we're talking about in this webinar? Let's take machine learning, let's put it into practice. So essentially, what we need to do and what we want to deliver as kind of the core under the hood functionality on the platform and Exabeam is connect the dots between activities based upon user or asset or entity, right? So asset and entity being a device that has an IP address, IoT, or end user's device, whatever it might be. And user being the identity. Okay, so the credential, whether it's Citizen AD or it's an identity access management tool in the cloud, we want to understand from the point of identity or asset what happens. So using machine learning and using statistical anomaly modeling functions, we look at the first event and we connect the dots thereafter. So when the user logs in or touches an application, we then look at the next event. And that kind of grows this graph. And each graph connects dots to other events. So if I log in as Richard Cassidy and I escalate my privileges to a service account admin, that graph still connects back to the fact that it was Richard that logged in, and I've switched, but it connects the dots to my switch. But my activity as a switched user or credential is still monitored, and that creates a new connection graph based off of the root graph, again, using machine learning and statistical anomaly functions. So what it means is we're able to connect all of the dots of all of the activity, whether it's something that comes from a network analysis tool or a cloud-based application or a local-based authentication function or whatever it might be. It's irrelevant to Exabeam. Exabeam knows that event is connected to this other event. And we want to keep that connection graph in situ because it allows us to do something very, very important. It allows us to build a session. And a session is a day in the life of a user. And if you think back to that SOC kind of workflow I took you through, that's a big challenge, right? Being able to say, well, what happened? I may have this malware alert on this endpoint, but what does that mean? Who's the user that's on the endpoint? Or were there multiple users? Were there account switches? And after the malware alert fired, was there anything else connected to this alert that I should know about? Did it laterally move? Did it not? Did it create a jump host? Did it install a new process, something that would normally see or not? So what the connection graph is doing, what machine learning is doing, is building this session end to end. And it's telling you everything that happened before, during, and after the event across all of your different platforms. So we'll take your database logs, your endpoint logs, your network analysis logs, your cloud logs, and we'll stitch together the full picture of what happened. But it's not just about that, because if we just did that in isolation, we'd have a lot of noise, and you'd have this massive storyline of everything that happened with no sense. So what we're doing in that storyline is applying risk scoring. So when we look at something, and let's take the VPN connection, for example, right? So this particular user VPNs in from lots of countries in her life. So every day we see her connect to the environment, we see lots of VPN connections. But what we're looking to do is baseline normal from abnormal on every single log source, whether that's an application, database, a login, an endpoint function, a process. I mean, the list is endless. We will anomaly baseline every single log source and stitch it together to the user. So when this user logs in from China for the first time ever, we know this is truly anomalous because we've seen the normal baseline activity. And that's where a statistical anomaly model becomes very powerful. So how do we apply that in principle and practice? Well, let's look at the alerts, okay? So again, we're taking that storyline that somebody VPN'd, copied a database table from the HR table and uploaded it to a website. Well, there are logs here that would have told you something was bad in isolation. So your VPN tool would have told you there's a VPN from China, okay? But how would you even register that that's an important event to your organization? Would it even show up on the analyst radar? And what about the malware alert that was triggered on the host before the database data was leaked? Well, you know, how many malware alerts do analysts get, and how do they triage what's important versus what's not if they don't understand what the risk is based upon normal and abnormal? And then what if the HR user accesses a database table? It's a HR user. Why wouldn't they access a database table? But if the table's copied, where would they even start their investigation? Would they go back in time? Would they try to look at the lateral movement? You know, because actually the problem with this issue is not so much what's happened to the database, it's how they got in the first place and how they're able to breach the environment. So if you apply machine learning here, you kind of get a different view of the picture, right? You get the fact that there's an abnormal login using VPN from China, because we know this is not the normal login for this particular user. Then you get this fact that she's accessing networks she doesn't normally access, because we know what every other user is doing. So we can tell using machine learning functions and statistical anomaly modeling that this is not what she normally does. And the risk for that particular event is extremely high. And you know, and in reality, you would know with Exabeam's platform just on the VPN incident. you wouldn't see the attack play out in a production environment. But in this particular example, we're letting it play out so you can sort of see how the story glues together. And then we look at her groups, right? Maybe this is something the HR group do every day. Maybe Barbara doesn't do it. But if we look at her group and nobody in her group is doing it, then we add more risk. And then we look at how she accesses the files in the database, and so on and so forth. And you get this timeline with risk associated. So that means it could be the most zero-day attack in the world, but Exabeam's going to know that maybe it's not a zero-day threat, but the activity is so different, so different from everybody else, every application, process, endpoint, service, user, that it is of a high risk to your organization, that you're going to be notified very quickly. So it's kind of applying a different sort of lens to the problem, but at the end of the day, giving analysts data that they can use. And to kind of wrap up here, to allow some time for questions, really it's about automating that information security lifecycle picture, as Matt sort of mentioned earlier, the kind of God view of what's occurred, not just on the particular incident you found, a group of incidents, but the entire story, and giving you a view that allows you to understand where the biggest risk variables were, and therefore what you're going to do about them. And you kind of get that into a production, into a kind of functional environment. You kind of start taking those potentially billions of logs, you start to bring it down into event data and sessions, and then you start to get from, potentially thousands of events or alerts to very, very sort of distilled, focused, high-risk events to your environment based upon the user and asset. And final slide, we deliver that in a platform that allows you to bring in logs from tools and solutions like Vectra to connect to your cloud environments into a platform that doesn't charge you based upon the volume of log data. It's a user-based flat and pricing model. So you're no longer going to have to worry about, am I going to get taxed if I want to bring in this new product? Because that's a big challenge in security. The more we want to see tend to be the more it kind of costs. Exabeam removed that headache with our sort of collect platform. And the detect function is the stuff that I've spoken about in this presentation, and of course wrapped around that in partnership with our sort of integration partners. We allow you to create response playbooks and tool sets around that to kind of deliver the true value from a mitigation perspective. So look, I know I've thrown a lot of words and functions at you, and we've talked a lot about kind of how Exabeam fits in, but I think now we shall hand it back and talk about some of the questions that might have been incited by the great presentations you've seen in this past hour.
It's great. So if you guys have any questions, please pop them into the question box now, and then we can go through them in a minute. Just to say thank you to everybody who has attended today. Thank you for taking the time out of your day. And then thank you especially to our two presenters who presented so nicely for us. We do appreciate you taking the time out of your day to share this information with us. We're just going to give it a minute or so just to see if there's any questions that come in, and then we'll field those if they do. So it seems like the presentations were rather comprehensive today, so there haven't been any questions. If there are any questions that come up, I will be sending a follow-up email after this. Please respond to it with any questions you have, and I will make sure that they get answered. Again, thank you very much to everybody for being here, and have a good day. Bye.